Everybody like and subscribe, praise the bell icon. Story number 1.
It was just an ordinary Saturday afternoon when Sarah decided to visit the local mall, hoping to catch a break from her hectic work schedule. The place was busy as usual, with teenagers laughing and walking around, families shopping, and the usual bustle of people trying to make their way through the crowded halls. She didn't expect anything out of the ordinary. After picking up a few things at a clothing store, Sarah decided to take a walk around the second floor to see if anything else caught her eye. The mall was large, and there were sections of it that felt slightly isolated, even though it was packed with people. She wandered past the food court and into a quieter section where the lights were dimmer, and the noise of the crowd seemed far away. As she was walking by a row of closed stores, Sarah noticed a man standing near a corner, his back to her. He was dressed in a long coat, even though it was warm inside the mall, and he was staring at a closed jewelry store. Something about him felt off. His posture was rigid, almost unnatural. Sarah couldn't put her finger on it, but a strange chill ran down her spine. She tried to shake off the feeling, but it lingered, and she turned to walk in the opposite direction. That's when she noticed something even more unsettling. The man wasn't alone. A figure, dressed in a similar coat, had appeared further down the hall, standing completely still and watching her. Sarah froze. The two figures made no attempt to interact with anyone around them, and their expressions were hidden by the shadows of their coats. She turned quickly, hurrying back toward the escalators, hoping to get away from them. As she made her way down the escalator, Sarah caught a glimpse of the man from the corner of her eye. He was following her, but moving strangely, almost as if he wasn't walking at all. She glanced around frantically, but no one else seemed to notice him or care. The mall was filled with people, yet none of them seemed aware of the two men stalking her. Her heart raced and panic set in. Reaching the first floor, Sarah made a beeline for the nearest exit, but she could see the man from the corner of her eye, still coming closer, still unnaturally still. She broke into a run, trying to get outside. As she neared the exit, her phone buzzed. It was a text from her friend. "Hey, where are you? I'm at the food court." Before Sarah could even respond, she saw a shadow cross her path. The man stood directly in front of the exit, his face still hidden by his coat's hood. Her breath caught in her throat, and every part of her screamed to turn around and run in the other direction. But the only way out was past him. Sarah stopped dead in her tracks. The man stood perfectly still, unmoving, just a few feet away. Then, to her horror, he raised his hand slowly, pointing at her. She could hear the faintest whisper, like a low murmur. Though the mall around them was crowded and loud, it felt as though the sound was coming from deep within the man's chest. At that moment, Sarah felt an icy wave of dread wash over her. The man's lips barely moved, but his whisper reached her ears clearly. "You don't belong here." Her entire body went cold. Without thinking, she bolted past him, shoving the door open and running outside into the parking lot. Sarah didn't stop running until she reached her car, locking the door behind her. Her hands shook as she fumbled with the keys, and for a moment, she thought she saw someone watching her from the reflection of the glass. She sped off. The image of the man burned into her mind. Even though she tried to convince herself it was just her imagination, something about the way he moved, how he stood there so still, unnerved her deeply. The worst part was that, when she returned to the mall the next week to meet her friend, the section of the mall where she had seen the man was completely abandoned. Not a soul was there, no stores, no people, nothing. The most unsettling detail of all? There was no record of the two men in any of the mall's security footage. No one had seen them, and no one seemed to know who they were. The mall was always a little quieter for Sarah after that day. She never went back, not even when her friends tried to convince her otherwise. She knew deep down that some things and some people should never be crossed. The mall was never just a mall to her anymore. It was something darker, something she couldn't fully understand. But she had felt it, and it would never leave her mind.
Story number 2.
It was a late winter evening when Jessica decided to stop by the mall on her way home. She was in the middle of a busy work week and needed a distraction, something mindless to take her mind off things. She had no particular destination in the mall, just wandering, looking for something to fill the time. It was nearly closing hour, but the mall still had a fair number of people inside. Jessica had never really paid attention to the mall's layout, but that night, something seemed different. The lights seemed dimmer than usual, the air a bit colder, and there was an eerie silence in the hallways, despite the fact that she could see several people in the distance. It almost felt as if the noise of the crowd had been muffled. She walked past the usual stores, but none of them caught her eye. She wandered deeper into the mall, into a section she'd never seen before, one of the lower floors, tucked away near the back. There was a small, unmarked hallway leading to a set of double doors. The doors were slightly ajar, a faint light spilling out from the crack. Curious, Jessica approached and pushed the doors open, stepping into what appeared to be an old, forgotten part of the mall. The area looked abandoned, with peeling wallpaper and dusty floors. There were no signs of life, no security cameras, and no other shoppers. She could hear her footsteps echoing off the walls as she moved deeper into the room. The air smelled stale, and the flickering lights overhead made the shadows dance eerily around her. The silence was almost oppressive, like the entire space was holding its breath. As she explored further, Jessica noticed something strange. On the walls were old, yellowing posters of past mall events, sales, concerts, fashion shows, and celebrity appearances. But these posters were old, too old for the mall's current time. She found herself standing in front of a large window at the end of the hallway, which looked out into a forgotten courtyard. The view was odd. There were no trees or benches, just overgrown plants and crumbling stone. A sense of unease crept over her, and she turned to leave. But the door had shut behind her. She tried to push it open, but it wouldn't budge. Panic began to rise in her chest as she turned and looked around. Something felt wrong, very wrong. Then she heard it, a low, guttural sound, almost like a whisper, but too far for her to understand. She froze, straining her ears. The noise was getting louder. It wasn't just one voice. It sounded like a chorus of murmurs, overlapping and blending together. She spun around, trying to find the source, but there was no one. Just her and the eerie silence of the abandoned hallway. Suddenly, from the corner of her eye, she saw movement. A shadow. It darted past the hallway, fast, too fast. Jessica blinked and looked again, but there was nothing there. Her heart pounded, and the air seemed to get thicker, suffocating. Desperate, she tried the door again, this time with more force. It still didn't open. Then, from behind her, she heard footsteps. Slow, dragging footsteps like someone or something was shuffling toward her. Jessica's breath hitched. She spun around, but the hallway was empty. The footsteps stopped. She ran back to the window, shaking the door desperately now. A chill ran through her body as she looked out at the overgrown courtyard again. The courtyard wasn't empty anymore. Standing in the middle, silhouetted against the dim light, was a figure, a tall man, dressed in what looked like a faded, old security uniform. His face was obscured by the shadow, but his posture was unnervingly rigid. Jessica's body went numb as the man slowly raised his hand and pointed directly at her. A cold, unnatural feeling washed over her, and she felt like she was being pulled into the scene. The figure didn't move, but she could feel his presence closing in on her. Without thinking, she stepped back, slamming her body against the door, hoping to break it open. To her surprise, the door gave way. She tumbled into the hall, gasping for breath, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. She looked back, and for a fleeting second, she thought she saw the figure standing at the doorway of the forgotten hallway. Jessica didn't stop running until she reached the nearest exit. She didn't even look back as she hurried to her car. When she checked her phone, it was almost midnight. But that wasn't what disturbed her the most. The part that gnawed at her wasn't the creepy hallway, the figure, or the strange noises. It was the fact that when she later mentioned the old section of the mall to a security guard, he looked at her with wide eyes. "There's no old section," he said. "That part of the building has been sealed off for years. It was abandoned long before the mall was renovated." And yet, Jessica knew what she had seen, what she had felt. The mall had been hiding something that wasn't just part of the building, something that lingered there, in the dark, waiting for the next curious soul to wander into its forgotten halls.
Story number 3.
It was a Wednesday night when Mark decided to stop by the mall. He hadn't planned on doing anything special, just picking up a few things, maybe grab a coffee at the food court. The mall had been nearly empty that evening, with only a handful of people scattered around. It was past the usual peak hours, but it wasn't too late. He figured it would be the perfect time to get in and out without the usual crowds. As he made his way past the familiar stores, Mark felt a strange unease settle in. The air was unusually still, and even though the mall lights were brightly illuminating the aisles, there was something off about it. It wasn't the kind of stillness that came with peace. No, it felt more like something was waiting, as if the mall itself was holding its breath. Mark shrugged off the feeling and continued walking toward the electronics store. As he passed one of the more isolated hallways, he noticed a store he'd never seen before. It was tucked away in the corner, next to a closed-off area of the mall. It was dark inside, but there was a faint glow coming from the back. The store's windows were dusty, the glass cracked in a few places, and the wooden sign above the door was barely legible, its faded letters spelling out curiosities. His curiosity piqued. Mark made his way inside. The air grew colder as he stepped into the dimly lit store. The first thing he noticed was the strange smell, like old wood, incense, and something he couldn't quite place. The shelves were filled with odd trinkets, small jars, strange figurines, antique-looking clocks, and various knickknacks that seemed to be from another time. Some of the items were covered in thick layers of dust, while others looked as though they had been recently placed there. Mark wandered deeper into the shop, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpeting on the floor. The back of the store seemed darker, and the objects there seemed even more unusual. Pale, twisted statues that almost looked human, jars filled with what appeared to be old, decayed bones, and strange mirrors that reflected nothing but shadow. As he reached out to touch a small, tarnished mirror, he felt an icy chill shoot up his spine. Something wasn't right. The store was giving off an oppressive, almost malicious energy, but he couldn't bring himself to leave. It felt as if something was drawing him in. That's when he heard it, a soft voice, barely a whisper, coming from somewhere behind him. "Do you see them?" Mark spun around, but no one was there. The air grew colder still, and the shadows in the corners of the store seemed to shift, stretching out like fingers reaching for him. A shiver ran down his spine, and he moved quickly toward the exit. But as he turned, he saw something in the reflection of one of the mirrors, a figure standing behind him. It was blurry at first, just a vague shape, but then it began to sharpen into focus. It was a woman, pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow and empty. Her mouth stretched into an unnerving smile, but she didn't move. She just stood there, staring at him. Mark's breath caught in his throat. He turned to flee, but the store's door slammed shut in front of him with a loud bang. He pulled on the handle, but it wouldn't budge. His heart began to race, panic rising in his chest. He backed away from the door, his eyes darting around the room. The mirrors were all reflecting things that weren't there, shadows moving where there should be none, figures appearing in the corners of his vision, always just out of reach. The woman in the mirror still stared at him, her smile growing wider, her eyes hollow and empty, as if they were sucking the life out of him. Mark bolted toward the back of the store, hoping to find another exit, but all he found was an old, ornate door. The door creaked open on its own, revealing a narrow staircase that descended into complete darkness. He hesitated, but the sound of footsteps from behind him pushed him forward. He couldn't stay here, not with whatever was stalking him in the store. He rushed down the staircase, but it seemed to go on forever, the walls closing in around him. Finally, he reached the bottom. There was only a small, dim light at the far end of a hallway, and the walls were covered in thick, black mold. He walked cautiously toward the light, his mind racing. The whispering was louder now, surrounding him, almost as if the walls themselves were speaking. "Do you see them?" He turned the corner and froze. The hallway opened into a large room, but it wasn't empty. Hundreds of eyes were staring at him from the walls, their lifeless, glassy stares boring into his soul. They were embedded in the walls, the floors, the ceiling, everywhere. Some of them blinked, some of them moved, but none of them seemed to care about the man standing there. Then he saw her again, the woman from the mirror. She was standing in the center of the room, her smile impossibly wide, her eyes dark and hollow. She reached out toward him with long, skeletal fingers, and Mark's feet seemed to move of their own accord. His heart pounded in his chest as he tried to run, but the walls closed in, the air thickening with a suffocating presence. Mark finally found himself back at the top of the stairs, gasping for air. But when he turned around, the store had disappeared. There was nothing but a blank wall where it had been moments before. He stumbled out of the mall, his mind spinning with what had just happened. He never spoke about what he saw to anyone, not even his closest friends. But every night since that day, he has heard whispers in the dark, soft, familiar, taunting whispers, like the woman's voice, always asking, "Do you see them?" And Mark knows now that he is being watched. The eyes, the ones embedded in the walls, the ones in the dark, they are always with him.
Story number 4.
It was a typical Friday night when Megan decided to go to the mall. She had just finished a long week of work and wanted to unwind a little. The weather outside was cold, so the idea of spending time indoors, walking around the mall, seemed like the perfect way to pass the time. The place was busy as usual, but the crowd seemed to thin out as the evening wore on, and by 9 p.m., the mall was nearly empty, except for a few late-night shoppers. Megan was in the home goods store when she noticed something strange. There was a door at the back of the store that she had never seen before. She'd been in the mall dozens of times, and she was certain this door hadn't been there before. The door was old, the wood warped with age, and it had a faint, rusty smell emanating from underneath it. It wasn't locked, though it was slightly ajar, just enough for Megan to see a dim light coming from the other side. Her curiosity piqued. She slowly approached the door. The faint smell of something burning filled her nostrils as she placed her hand on the handle and pushed it open. The door creaked loudly, as though it hadn't been opened in years. Megan stepped inside, finding herself in what looked like a small hallway. The walls were lined with old, faded wallpaper, and the air felt heavy, stagnant. There were no windows, and the only light came from an old chandelier hanging from the ceiling, its crystals covered in layers of dust. The hallway stretched ahead, and Megan, driven by a mixture of fear and curiosity, began walking down it. The quiet was unsettling. There was no sound of footsteps, no voices, no other signs of life. Only the eerie hum of the light above her, which seemed to flicker every few seconds. The further she walked, the more the air seemed to thicken, as if she were walking into some forgotten, buried part of the mall. She didn't know why, but the deeper she went, the more she felt like something was watching her, waiting for her to make a mistake. After what felt like an eternity, Megan reached the end of the hallway. There in front of her was a door, similar to the one she had just passed through, except this one was much older, and the wood was warped almost beyond recognition. There was no handle, just an old, rusted keyhole. Megan hesitated for a moment, wondering whether she should turn back, but something deep inside her told her she had to see what was behind that door. With trembling hands, she pressed against the door. To her surprise, it creaked open easily. She stepped inside and immediately felt the temperature drop. The room was cold, unnaturally cold, like she had stepped into a freezer. Her breath came out in visible puffs as she looked around. The room was small, just a simple square with walls lined with dark, wooden shelves. The shelves were filled with various items, but none of them looked normal. They were twisted, warped, or completely bizarre. Broken dolls with eyes that seemed to follow her, cracked mirrors that reflected nothing but darkness, jars filled with things that couldn't be identified. There was one item on the far side of the room that caught her eye. It was an old-fashioned ornate mirror, framed in gold that was now tarnished with age. Unlike the other mirrors in the room, this one didn't seem to reflect her image. Instead, it seemed alive. The reflection in the glass wasn't of the room behind her, but of a different place, a different time. The image showed what looked like an old Victorian-style mall, filled with people wearing clothes from the 1800s. The faces of the people were blank, emotionless, their eyes wide open as if they were all staring directly at her. Megan couldn't pull her eyes away. The longer she looked into the mirror, the more the people in the reflection began to move, their heads turning toward her, slowly, one by one. Then, as if they all had the same thought at once, they began to smile. A slow, wide, grotesque grin that stretched across their faces, revealing rows of sharp yellow teeth. The sound of their laughter echoed in her mind, faint at first, but growing louder and louder until it felt like it was coming from inside her head. Panicked, Megan stumbled backward, her heart pounding in her chest. She reached out for the door, but when she turned to leave, the hallway was gone. The room was closing in around her. The shelves of strange items seemed to get closer, the floor beneath her feet warping and bending as if it were alive. She screamed, but the sound was muffled, swallowed by the thick air of the room. She turned back to the mirror, and to her horror, the people in the reflection were no longer smiling. They were screaming. Silent screams, their faces twisted in agony as they reached out toward her, their hands pressing against the glass. Then, as if they had all converged at once, their hands shattered the glass, and the mirror cracked down the middle. Megan's eyes widened in terror as the glass split, and the reflection of the room began to pour out into the real world, spilling onto the floor like liquid. The people from the reflection began to emerge from the shards, their bodies disjointed and twisted, their mouths hanging open in silent screams. They crawled toward her, dragging themselves across the floor with unnatural speed. Megan's breath caught in her throat as she turned to flee, but as she reached the door, she saw that it had disappeared, replaced by a solid wall. She was trapped. The last thing she heard was the laughter, the same laughter that had echoed in her mind earlier, growing louder and louder until it swallowed her whole. No one ever found Megan. The mall was searched from top to bottom, but there was no sign of her. The odd hallway, the strange room, and the mirror were all gone, as though they had never existed. But on occasion, when the mall is particularly quiet and the lights flicker, some people claim to hear laughter, a low, haunting sound echoing from somewhere deep within the walls. And sometimes, if you look closely in the mirrors of the mall, you can just make out the faintest reflection, her eyes wide with terror, trapped behind the glass.